Dr. Paul Byrne practiced medicine as a neonatologist and pediatrician for 55 years. He's currently the president of the Life Guardian Foundation, an organization that works to protect, preserve, and defend life from conception to its natural end. Dr. Byrne is an expert on brain death and works to inform people about this troubling diagnosis and how it differs from true death.
You could have almost any definition that you want for brain death. All of the laws are around the absence of brain function. An absence of the functioning or the function doesn't mean that the brain is destroyed. When a physician observes an absence of the functioning, it doesn't mean that the function is gone. Like my automobile right now is not functioning, but the function isn't gone. All it does is take a key and a driver, and the function is there. And that's the way that medicine is. So an absence of the functioning does not mean that the person is dead.
Not accepting the brain death diagnosis, what, in your opinion, is the definition of death?
Death, of course, is when the life is absent from the body. We should not be declaring people dead until we are as certain as we can possibly be that the soul has separated, that the life is gone. No one should be declared dead unless there is destruction of at least the three major vital systems of the body: the circulatory system, the respiratory system, and the brain. And then that determination should be made in accord with generally accepted criteria.
Teresa Dampf is a former EMT driver and has worked as an ER and ICU nurse since 1998. Throughout her career, Teresa has sat in on multiple presentations from organ procurement organizations regarding the brain death diagnosis. After educating herself on the facts, Teresa learned the subjective nature of the diagnosis and how the criteria can differ between doctors and hospitals.
There is not a complete criteria for brain death. There's no law that says this is what brain death is. When I became an emergency room RN, we had to stay after our shift and listen to a representative from one of the procurement companies from California. And so this gentleman, he came up and he had a nice PowerPoint presentation, and at the very end he said, "Does anyone have any questions?" I said, "I just want to make sure I have what you said correct. Did you say that a person has to be 100% brain dead in order to be diagnosed as brain dead?" And he says, "Yes, that's correct. That's what I said." And I said, "Well, isn't it true that, let's say, I don't know, 50% of your brain is injured and the other is not?" I said, "Can't you still be diagnosed as brain dead?" And he said, "Well, yes, that's true." And all the heads in the room, the doctors and nurses that were there, went like this, like, "Whoa, what just happened?" I said, "I just want to make sure you said that you listed all these particular tests that need to be done to declare someone brain dead, but isn't it true there is no legislation, no criteria that says any of this has to be done to declare someone brain dead?" And he said, "Well, yes, that's true. Technically, 2 doctors can declare someone brain dead, but they typically will do these tests."
Accepted medical standards can be whatever the doctor says, can be whatever the hospital says, can be whatever the American Neurological Association says, but they can be different according to a different doctor. But to just use accepted medical standards makes the criteria for brain death to be the weakest of all laws.
When we return, we'll learn how quickly some medical professionals move to make a brain death diagnosis. Bobby Schindler is the brother of Terry Schiavo and the president of the Terry Schiavo Life and Hope Network. As chairman of the network's board, I've personally seen how Bobby and his family have made it their mission to help families who are dealing with the trauma brain death diagnoses bring. Bobby's working to dispel the hopelessness of these diagnoses and fight for a patient's right to basic and continued care.
I think the increase in calls that we're seeing is concerning, knowing how quick hospitals and doctors are to issue or to come to some type of conclusion that this person in a very short amount of time is brain dead. Families are being told that there's no hope or chance of any type of recovery, yet they're seeing certain types of responses by simple stimulations that the family's performing on their loved ones, questioning really whether or not the person is truly brain dead. We saw on a national type of event with the Jahai McMath case. She went in for a tonsil surgery and something went terribly wrong, and she experienced a brain injury. And doctors believed that she was brain dead, and they made this diagnosis in a very short period of time. They were putting pressure, a tremendous amount of pressure on the parents to end Jahai's life, where the parents simply wanted more time to see if Jahai was going to in fact recover. In fact, they said there were signs that she was responsive to certain types of stimulation. But the hospital wanted nothing to do with giving this young girl time. They were putting a tremendous amount of pressure on the family to remove Jahai's ventilator.
And how long has it been since she was diagnosed as brain dead?
It's been going on 2 years now. In fact, there's been neurologists now that have personally examined Jahai and are going on record and saying that she is not brain dead. It's a case that I think is going to really change things in how hospitals perhaps treat this whole brain death controversy.
So what is the current status of Jahai McMath as far as legalities?
Jahai was issued a death certificate. I know the family is trying to get that lifted.
And on the death certificate, the cause of death is?
The cause of death is still pending. So
the cause is pending?
That's why this case is really so important, because the brain death diagnosis still is very controversial. Hospitals are still using it, and I think in a way that is not in the best interest of the patient or the family.
Back in the 90s and previous to even that, it was common for someone to spend 3 months in an ICU, 6 months in an ICU, maybe even up to a year. To be on a ventilator for 2 months was not unheard of. I personally had experience with my own father. He was in the ICU on a ventilator. He was conscious. And the following day, the doctor came in and changed the story and said my dad would be on a ventilator for the rest of his life, and was basically prepping us to, you know, give him some morphine and take him off the vent. He came off the vent 5 days later, and he was able to breathe, and he was eventually stepped down in the hospital. And what was really interesting is when I spoke to the secretary in that ICU, I said, "Oh, you must have a lot of gifts, you know, food and flowers and things from the patient's family." And she looked at me a little puzzled, and she said, "Well, what do you mean?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I mean, you know, when people stay here a long time." And she goes, "Oh, nobody stays here a long time." And that was my first hint that something was really wrong. And after 3 days that my dad was on the ventilator, nurses were saying, "You know, your dad's been on the vent for a long time." And I said, 3 days is a long time? And they said, "Yeah." And then when he was finally weaned from it on day 5, nurses and doctors were coming in, seeing him sitting up talking, and they just were amazed. So in my experience, patients are being given the diagnosis of brain death, or there's no hope. They're not even giving patients a chance to heal.
Lucrative financial outcomes can be a factor in determining a brain death diagnosis. Long-term care can incur high costs for hospitals, and many patients declared brain dead are perfect candidates for organ harvesting, a procedure that financially benefits the medical community.
I think hospitals might see that this person is going to be in this type of condition for a prolonged period of time, and they might be quote-unquote expensive. So they look at this as being very costly, and therefore are going to try to do what they can to convince the family members to take the steps to end the person's life. And then at the same time, the organ donation program could play into these decisions, where the hospital, the doctors want to try and get the organs from this person, and therefore are making these decisions rather quickly to tell the family that, look, there's no hope, and the best thing for the family to do is to harvest their loved ones' organs to give life and hope to somebody else, because your loved one simply has no chance in making any type of meaningful recovery.
Organ transplant industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. The organ transplant industry is larger than the abortion industry, and so yes, there's many dollars involved. I've seen estimates that someone who is brain dead is worth $1 million. I've seen articles that said a heart is worth $1 million to a university, not just for the transplant, but for the income that they'll get in the next year. It's large amounts of money.
In a moment, we'll hear one woman's story of recovering from a brain death diagnosis. Jenny Hammond was a registered nurse for 12 years and is a former executive director of California Nurses for Ethical Standards. Her desire to become a nurse began 30 years ago when her life almost ended. Jenny had a history of small epileptic seizures, and in 1985 she contracted Giardia and was treated with Flagyl. This medication is contraindicated for patients with central nervous system disorders. The first dose caused a grand mal seizure. Jenny's husband was unable to wake her the next morning, and she was later declared brain dead. Were you aware he was trying to wake you?
Yes, but I was unable to respond. And he called 911. They took me to the hospital, and they said, we can't get the seizure to stop. And they were pumping me full of the drugs that they give, which are neurosuppressants, meaning they lower or suppress brainwave activity. Finally, I coded. My heart stopped, my breathing stopped. The next time I was aware of anything, I was in the ICU. I was unable to move, to speak, to open my eyes. I was what they call locked in. But I was fully conscious and aware of what was going on around me. There was one nurse I remember very well. She would speak to me every time she was in the room and let me know what she was doing, why she was there. She called me by name. There was another nurse, I came to recognize her footsteps and the little sounds that she would make, but she never spoke to me until one day I heard her voice. Would somebody come in here and help me move this thing?
Seriously?
Seriously. She called me this thing. I was a piece of meat. I was a burden. Time was hard to judge. I had awake times and asleep times. And when I was awake, I understood everything that was going on. But I wasn't always awake. I did have sleep time. And one of the awake times, I heard multiple footsteps coming into the room. And one male voice saying, this one's a sad case. Young woman, 2 small children at home. Her husband is being completely unreasonable. If he would just sign the forms, so many people could benefit from her organs. And I thought, you can't have my organs. I need my organs. There was another voice spoke up and said, Doctor, is it appropriate to talk like this in front of the patient? He said, hello, she's brain dead. She can't hear anything. She doesn't understand anything. There's nothing there. She only has about a 1% chance of coming out of this coma. And if she does, she'll be a vegetable.
So your determination was pretty strong at that point, I'm guessing?
Pretty strong at that point. It was less than a week later I came out of the coma.
Jenny was in a coma and on a ventilator for 3 weeks, and it was a long road to recovery once she woke up. After her experience, Jenny chose to become a nurse with a passion to compassionately care for people who experience situations similar to her own. She believes patients with brain injuries and brain death diagnoses are not necessarily dead. Instead, families and patients should be afforded hope, time, and a right to basic care.
I'm not an expert on on at what point is a person truly dead. But I do believe that, I don't believe that brain death is true death. However, I do think that there are cases of people who simply will not recover from brain injury. But that brain injury is not necessarily the same as death. And even if the brain is not functioning, if they're able to breathe on their own and they're not respirator dependent, then their brain is still functioning.
Bobby, do you think people in a so-called persistent vegetative state have a right to basic care, and if so, why?
The vegetative state diagnosis is very, very dangerous for several reasons. Literally, it can serve as a death sentence because many of the courts, many of the laws in states, many of the state laws today use the PVS diagnosis as a criteria to end a person's life if the family or the hospital agrees to do so. And we saw that in Terry's, my sister's situation. It also can be a death sentence, figuratively speaking, because what happens is the vast majority of times the insurance, if this person does have certain types of insurances that would help with rehabilitation and therapy, or whatever type of funding that they might receive for rehabilitation and therapy to help with the person's brain injury, the vast majority of the time this is cut off. So the family doesn't have access now to getting that person what they so desperately need, which is rehabilitation and therapy for whatever brain injury that they experienced. The family is put in a position where they can't offer the help that their loved one needs. Furthermore, the PVS diagnosis is completely subjective, and they're finding through more and more research that it's a diagnosis that is incorrect almost 50% of the time. So we're looking at a diagnosis that is used to kill people with brain injuries, as it was in Terry's case, that is incorrect almost half the time. What we're finding, many of these individuals are in a minimally conscious state and need more and more, or need additional rehabilitation and therapy to try and improve upon the brain injury that they've experienced. So the PVS it's really a flawed diagnosis. We need to remove it from these decisions that are being made when it comes to whether a person should live or die, or when it comes to whether a person should receive rehabilitation or not.
Coming up, we'll hear advice for families who are facing a brain death diagnosis. A silent and deadly epidemic is moving across our country. Diagnoses of brain death have been steadily increasing over the past several years. Decisions are being made by medical professionals regarding the life and death of patients, sometimes without the family's participation. So-called brain-dead patients are often dismissed as too expensive to keep alive and beyond hope. But families need to remain strong, be patient, and hold on to hope for their loved one's sake. Jenny, what would you say to a family whose family member has been diagnosed with brain death and now they're contemplating their choices?
There is no true standard for diagnosing brain death. It's very subjective. One doctor's opinion of brain death is different than another. You cannot necessarily trust a diagnosis of brain death as being truly dead.
A family should be afforded every opportunity to get second opinions. If they're in a situation where they can offer that loved one some type of rehabilitation and therapy, they should be afforded that opportunity. Whatever the situation might be, ultimately the families or the guardians that are making these decisions should be the ones that have the final say in what happens to these individuals.
Educate themselves on the truth, because unless you really understand what this is all about, this brain death criteria, what's the history of it? Where did it come from? Why is it happening? What's the financial benefits of it? Unless someone really knows, whether you're a medical professional or a lay person, you really can't advocate for someone very well beyond just, trying to stand your ground and say no, no, no.
And it seems like the prevailing message here is that it takes a long time for the brain to heal, so be patient.
We're seeing now where we're finding more and more research where the brain can heal itself To simply write a person off as a brain injury and say they're never going to improve or it'd be in their best interest to just end their lives, I think we're making a terrible mistake. Obviously not only for the person that these decisions are being made for, but also for the families that are willing and wanting to care for them. It's very easy to simply say, oh, they're not going to get better, let's just end their life, let's just kill them. Yes, the hard decision is to care for these people, but it's the right decision, and it's a decision of compassion and love. And it's really a reflection upon us, really as a nation, how we're going to care for our most vulnerable.